So after several seasons of telling you how the race was won, I thought I might share some of my thoughts on how to watch a race, because it is a little bit more complicated than, say, a cat video. I live in the US, where the hardest part is generally finding an event. If you want to play by the rules, you'll probably need a complex combination of satellite dish and cable packages. But if you actually want to see bike races, you can use something like a proxy service or just try Googling "watch live cycling" and clicking through the links that come up. Eventually you'll get to something like this, or probably more like this. But the important parts, km to go in the race, the time gap to the breakaway, and the number of riders in the break, should still all be visible. These three things give you the race situation. It's like the scoreboard in a ball sport. The numbers vary from event to event, but generally speaking, if there's more than 60 kilometers to go, more than 3 minutes to the breakaway, and fewer than a dozen riders in the break, you can relax. Nothing super exciting is going to happen for the next few minutes. It's not that there's nothing to watch at this point in the race. In fact, knowing which teams have put in the most work or which riders in the break seem strongest are critical backstory to the rest of the event. But barring a freak accident like a huge pileup or a rogue horse, if this 60k 3-minute dozen rider standard is met, nothing race altering is imminent. This leaves time for the critical elements of settling in to watch. A little coffee, a trip to the restroom, and yes, hashtags are important, as we'll discuss later. If you're in Europe, your routine is probably a little different, and if you're in Australia, it's the middle of the night. So, sorry? If you're watching this video, you're probably hoping for something with English commentary, but if you haven't followed the rules, you're more likely to come across Dutch. And this is one of many places where Twitter comes in handy as a viewing companion. Even if you do understand the broadcast audio, Twitter brings in thousands of additional eyeballs to see things you might have missed. Plus lots of speculation on what's happening, why it's happening, what might happen next, and even the occasional joke. Hashtags are also the easiest way to seek out conversation specifically about a race. Admittedly, they're not always the most obvious things, but after one or two of them, you'll probably start to catch on. But back to the racing. Things will begin to pick up as the gap starts to fall. There's a rule of thumb that a chase can bring back 1 minute per 10 kilometers, but a better way to guess is to watch what the riders on the road are actually doing. When riders start to attack out of the breakaway, it generally means things aren't going well for them. Keeping an eye on the front of the pack is helpful too. The standard chase mode is 1 or 2 teams with 5 or 6 riders at the front, sharing the work of setting pace, sometimes chatting and joking a bit with each other. But generally, the chase gets more intense as the catch approaches. The chaos surrounding a recapture is also a popular time to launch attacks, and this means that as it approaches, teams will start to bring their riders closer to the front. When the field starts to change shape rapidly or weave across the road, it's a sure sign that people are nervous and the heat is on. It's this wider section of the field, just behind the lead riders, that's the most important. It's the sweet spot, close enough to the front to react to attacks and avoid crashes, but not so close to the front that you're losing energy to the wind. This area will show you who's marking who's feeling weak and having trouble holding position, and who's best supported by their team, saving energy until their critical moment arrives. I'd say that most bike races tend to end in largest sprints, with 30 or more riders. And in these events, most contenders' critical moment is around 200 meters to go, and the sweet spot is the most interesting in the last 3-ish kilometers, as a faster pace starts to narrow the field, making shelter near the front smaller and smaller, forcing riders to do all sorts of crazy things to keep their position in line without losing energy by sticking their nose out into the wind. In fact, this pattern of sweet spot critical moment appears in almost every kind of race. Even on mountaintop finishes, which are settled from much smaller groups and slow, cagey duels based on power to mass ratio, teams will still chase and battle to bring their leader into the foot of the final climb as close to the front as possible, as rested as possible. Where things get really exciting is the classics. These one-day races are full of cobbled sections, steep bergs, narrow roads, and sharp corners, so pretty much every meter of roadway in the final 50 kilometers is a potential critical moment, each with its own mini sweet spot battle just in front of it. But these factors also string out and break up the pack, meaning top contenders have to fight for position for very long distances with only 1 or 2 teammates to protect them. Saving energy becomes much less about just drafting and much more about tactics, generally speaking, tricking your opponents into doing your work for you. These uncertain conditions also put a big premium on riders and teams being able to improvise their own critical moments rather than having them planned in advance. Keep in mind that these are all relatively broad statements. Early breaks do sometimes win, the pack occasionally sits up completely just before a catch, and teams have managed to sweet spot their leader into the closing meters of a classic. But generally speaking, this pattern of sweet spot critical moment is what I look for when I'm trying to find the details of how the race was won.
And if you don't know, now you know, you know, you know.
You know very well who you are.
Money hold,
Don't let 'em hold you down.
bankroll,
Reach for the stars.
so
from a common thief to up close and personal with Robin Leach.